She sat quietly in her wheelchair, reading. Then, a millionaire's bodyguard hurled her to the airport floor, clearing space for his boss's designer luggage. 40 people watched. Not one moved, too afraid of the family's name to lift a finger. What none of them noticed was the quiet figure in the corner, or the 90-pound military working dog lying at his feet. In the next 8 seconds, this off-duty Navy SEAL would turn their world inside out and ignite a courtroom war that would reshape every life it touched. Drop a comment and tell us what country you're watching from. And if these stories stay with you, hit subscribe. Terminal 4 smelled like recycled desperation, expensive perfume layered over burnt espresso and the stale nerves of 1,000 strangers. Most people coped by disappearing into their phones. Mason didn't have that luxury. Ignoring his surroundings had long ago stopped being something his body allowed. He'd chosen a corner seat in the boarding lounge. Back pressed to a concrete pillar, not random, instinctive. The way a man picks a position when he spent years mapping exits and measuring threat distance before his conscious mind catches up. Active duty Navy SEAL, a body that read like a record of damage, and a mind that processed tactical information the way other people processed small talk. Lean, dense with functional muscle that coiled beneath a plain grey t-shirt like cable under canvas. A tactical cap sat low on his brow, cutting the fluorescent glare, those lights that buzzed at a frequency nobody else seemed to register. At his boots lay Atlas, 90 pounds of German shepherd, coat the shade of toasted sable. Eyes sharp enough to make strangers look away. Atlas was no pet. Multi-purpose canine. 3 deployments. His black tactical vest read ___, quote, _0__ in blunt white letters. The dog's chin rested heavy on Mason's tan boot. But those ears, they never stopped, tracking every rolling suitcase, every overhead chime. Both of them were running on fumes. A high-intensity training cycle had ground them past the failure point and out the other side. Still, even exhausted, something in them stayed coiled. Relaxed readiness, a state civilians never quite understand. They were waiting on a flight back to base, a thin seam of stillness between the chaos of fieldwork and the routine of the barracks. 15 feet from Mason's pillar, a large blue sign marked the priority seating area, the International Disability symbol, a small pocket of calm in the airport's current of noise. Seated there was Irina, late 20s if he had to guess, a quiet dignity about her that didn't ask for anything. She was paralyzed from the waist down, in a lightweight wheelchair so well fitted it looked less like equipment and more like part of her. Cream-colored cardigan, a book open on her lap, eyes steady across the page. There was a stillness to her that Mason recognized. Not fragility, composure. She wore her skin like someone who'd stopped apologizing for the space she occupied. She didn't look like someone who needed saving. She looked like someone who'd already fought her own war and walked out, or rather, rolled out, carrying a different kind of armor. That quiet wouldn't hold. It broke apart not with a scream or a crash, but with an entrance. The Sterling family didn't arrive. They colonized the space. Mr. Sterling came first, mid-50s, a suit that cost more than a decent car, his face locked into an expression of permanent, rehearsed displeasure. His wife trailed behind him, draped in silk, a designer handbag held out like a royal insignia. Two teenage sons followed, moving with that performative boredom only the deeply privileged ever master. They were loud. Their voices spread across the terminal like something invasive, swallowing the low murmur of the crowd. They moved without awareness of anyone around them, or maybe with full awareness and full indifference, expecting the world to part. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, one, underscore, underscore. Mr. Sterling's voice sliced through the lounge. I told them we needed lounge access, and now we're out here with the masses. My back is killing me. He surveyed the crowded seating area, face twisted with open contempt. His gaze settled on the priority zone. The blue sign was right there, bold, unmistakable. He either didn't see it or didn't care. What he saw was open space, and one woman occupying it. He flicked his wrist toward Arena. Over there, at least there's some room. Boys, get the bags down before somebody else grabs those seats. The two sons moved without hesitation. They crossed toward Arena with a kind of lazy entitlement that made the hair on Mason's neck rise. The taller one, bleached hair, designer sweatshirt, swung an oversized leather duffel onto the empty seat beside Arena's wheelchair. Metal buckles cracked against plastic. He never once looked at her, just turned to his brother, grinning. Finally, some legroom. Thought we'd have to stand like peasants. Arena lifted her eyes from her book. Her expression was calm, controlled. She closed the cover, one finger holding her page, and addressed the man who appeared to be their father. Excuse me, sir, she said, voice clear and level. I don't mean to be a bother, but this is a designated priority area for travelers with disabilities. There are signs throughout the terminal for general seating, just a few gates down. Mr. Sterling didn't break stride. He reached the zone and planted himself directly above her, crowding her space. Even if she'd been standing, he would have towered over her by a full head. He wielded that height like a blade. Listen, sweetheart, he said, his tone soaked in a patronizing sweetness far uglier than any shout. We've had a very long day, and we've paid a lot of money for these tickets. I think we can all share a little space. It's not like you're using all these seats, are you? It's not about how many seats I'm using, Arena answered, voice steady despite his looming presence. It's about accessibility requirements. My wheelchair needs the clearance this area provides so I don't block the aisle for other passengers. It's a safety regulation as much as a courtesy. Mrs. Sterling stepped forward now, nose wrinkling as though she'd caught a foul odor. She waved vaguely toward the packed corridor. Mason watched it all from his pillar. His eyes narrowed. He felt Atlas shift beside him, the dog's muscles drawing tight, reading the rising tension. Mason's hand found the dog's head. A silent command. Stay. But his own pulse was climbing. He'd witnessed this behavior on every continent he'd ever set foot on. The arrogance of people who treated their own comfort as universal law, who believed rules existed only for those with less money. I'm not moving, Arena said, and now steel edged into her voice for the first time. This area is reserved for a reason. Please move your bags. Mister. Sterling's expression shifted. The thin veneer of polite irritation cracked, exposing something far uglier beneath. He glanced at his sons, then back at her. 15, he said, his voice dropping low. 16. He turned his back on her, conversation over. As he pivoted, his heavy leather briefcase swung wide. It struck the wheel of her chair with a metallic thud. Irina flinched. Her hands clamped down on the armrests. The sons piled more bags onto the surrounding seats, walling her in. They laughed, traded plans about their destination, acting as though the human being 2 feet away was nothing more than inconvenient furniture. The tension hung in the air like something solid. Travelers nearby averted their eyes, shrinking from the confrontation building in front of them. Mason did not look away. He rose slowly from his seat. Atlas stood in perfect unison beside him. The predator had stirred. Something shifted in the terminal air, a low, dangerous current, as Mr. Sterling turned his back on Irina. A gesture of total dismissal. It landed like a blow. Irina sat motionless for 1 heartbeat, fingers pressed against the carbon fiber rims of her wheels. Not trembling from fear, trembling from years of injustice swallowed in a world that was never built to hold her. She stared at the wall of expensive leather luggage hemming her in, a barricade made of vanity and entitlement. She drew a breath. Her voice came out quieter now, but honed, precise as a surgical instrument. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 17 underscore, underscore. Mr. Sterling stopped mid-stride. He didn't turn right away. He released a long, theatrical sigh that pulled smirks from his sons. When he finally pivoted, the polished mask of the successful businessman had shattered. What remained was something raw, the petty fury of a man who had never heard the word no from someone he considered beneath him. He didn't see a human being in that chair. He saw a malfunction in his flawless afternoon, a glitch to be erased. He didn't address Irina at all. His gaze drifted over his shoulder toward a figure standing motionless in the shadows near the boarding gate. The general crowd hadn't noticed this man. Mason had clocked him the moment he walked in. The man's name was Miller. He stepped into the light. A mountain of bone and muscle, maybe 35, with a neck thick as a tree trunk and a buzz cut sharp enough to cut skin. A black tactical polo stretched across his enormous chest. Khaki trousers concealed the reinforced boots underneath. His eyes, flat, empty of anything resembling conscience. The eyes of a man paid to act, not to consider. Miller was the Sterling's private shield, a bodyguard for their arrogance, and he moved with heavy, deliberate thuds that parted the crowded aisle without a single word. Quote 19. Mr. Sterling said, his voice cold, dangerously low. Quote 20. The phrasing was careful, vague enough for legal cover. The meaning was not vague at all. Miller didn't pause. He didn't ask Irina to relocate. He didn't extend a hand. He simply advanced, his massive frame swallowing the light from the terminal windows. Irina looked up at him. Her eyes went wide, her breath caught. She tried to reverse the wheelchair, but the Sterling's luggage was stacked too high behind her, a cage of designer bags sealing her in. The passengers around them finally sensed it. The verbal sparring was tilting towards something far uglier. A woman nearby gasped, pulling her child close, but she stayed where she was. A businessman glanced up from his laptop, frowned, then dropped his gaze right back to the screen. He chose his digital refuge over the violence gathering 6 feet away. Miller extended one enormous, calloused hand. He didn't touch Irina. He seized the armrest of her wheelchair. His thick fingers pressed deep into the padding. "You heard the man?" he ground out, voice like gravel being crushed underfoot. "You're in the way." What came next was sudden and savage. He didn't just pull the chair, he wrenched the side upward and shoved. Pure, gratuitous cruelty, a demonstration of force designed to humiliate as much as to remove. The physics were merciless. That lightweight, precision-balanced wheelchair was never engineered to absorb lateral force of that magnitude. It tipped instantly. Irina released a sharp, startled cry, cut short as her body pitched sideways. She had no sensation below her waist, no way to brace her legs, no way to catch her own weight. She was a passenger in her own fall. Her shoulder struck the cold, unforgiving linoleum first. Then came the sickening thud of her hip. The wheelchair, suddenly weightless, careened across the tile and toppled sideways, wheels spinning in empty air like some overturned insect. Irina lay on the ground, her cream cardigan twisted beneath her. The book had landed several feet away, pages trembling under the air conditioner's breath. The sound of that impact was something no one nearby would soon forget. Not just a body striking linoleum, it was the sound of a person's dignity cracking open in a public space. For a handful of seconds, Terminal 4 went mute. Even the overhead lights seemed to hum louder in the void. The Sterlings stood there, the sons briefly stunned, momentarily human. Mrs. Sterling simply adjusted her silk wrap and turned her gaze elsewhere, as though a woman crumpled on the floor was an offense against taste she refused to acknowledge. Mr. Sterling made no move to help. He glanced at Miller and gave one curt nod. Approval. Quote 23. Mr. Sterling said, "No remorse, not a trace." Quote 24. Irina didn't move. Her cheek pressed flat against cold tile that reeked of industrial wax and 10,000 passing shoes. Hair had slipped free of its clip, fallen across her face in loose strands. She wasn't crying. Not yet. Her mind was somewhere else, suspended in the impossible arithmetic of what had just happened. In a crowded terminal, in a modern city, in full daylight, she had been physically thrown away like refuse. Pain was blooming now through her shoulder, a deep, rolling throb that whispered dislocation, or something worse. But the crowd's silence cut deeper than any fracture could. 40-some people within clear view stood paralyzed. Their faces told the same cowardly story. Bystander paralysis, collective shame dressed up as helplessness. That silence, though, it didn't hold. Something shattered it from the corner of the lounge, a sound no human throat could produce. Low, vibrational, a growl born in the chest of something predatory, rolling through the air like a transmission from the deep. Atlas was on his feet, front paws spread wide, head dropped low, upper lip peeled back to expose teeth designed to shred tactical armor. The fur along his spine bristled into a jagged crest, and his eyes locked onto Miller with a focus that was absolute, surgical, terrifying. Mason stood beside him, but the man slouched against that pillar moments ago no longer existed. His posture had reorganized into something lethal. Exhaustion had burned away, replaced by the cold diamond clarity of a SEAL who had just designated a high-value target. He didn't raise his voice. Didn't swear. He moved with a silent, frightening economy, stepping over his bag, crossing toward the center of the zone. Each stride carried the weight of a verdict already reached. The temperature around him seemed to drop, and passengers who'd been averting their eyes now found themselves locked on the man in the grey t-shirt and the black dog at his side. Miller heard the growl. He turned. His chest expanded as he watched Mason approach. Knuckles cracking, slow, deliberate, a confident grin spreading wide. He saw a smaller man, a dog on a lead, and he calculated, wrongly, that he was still the most dangerous presence in this room. He had no concept that the countdown on his arrogance had already reached 0. Within the next 8 seconds, Terminal 4 would learn the difference between a bully collecting a paycheck and a warrior moving with purpose. The shift from stillness to violence was not gradual. For Mason, it was binary. A molecular rearrangement of everything around him. Those 8 seconds didn't begin when he reached the Sterlings. They began the instant his boot lifted from the linoleum near his pillar. To the horrified onlookers in Terminal 4, Mason dissolved into a streak of grey and shadow, a trained predator cutting through a flock of frozen sheep. He did not run. Running was wasteful, amateur. He moved instead with a ghost-like precision. Body low, center of gravity locked, closing 15 feet of distance before Miller's smirk had time to fully form. Miller registered the dog first. Atlas, 90 pounds of fur and focused muscle, launched on a single unspoken command that traveled through the leash like current through wire. The German Shepherd did not bark. Barking was a warning, and the moment for warnings had ended the instant arena struck the floor. Atlas launched from 3 feet out, his body stretching through the air like a guided projectile. He didn't strike with teeth, not the throat, not the limbs. This was a Tier 1 military working dog, trained for non-lethal takedowns in volatile situations. Atlas drove his full body weight into the center of Miller's chest like a battering ram. The sound was dense, heavy, a sandbag slamming granite. Miller, all that gym-sculpted bulk and swagger, never had a chance to brace. Air punched out of his lungs in a strangled wheeze as the dog's momentum folded them both onto the floor. Atlas locked him down in an instant, front paws pinning shoulders, snout hovering inches from the man's wide eyes. A growl, low, continuous, almost geological, pressing Miller into the tile with raw, ancient terror. At the same moment, Mason closed the distance to Mr. Sterling. The businessman watched his hired wall of muscle crumble in a single heartbeat. Something cold and unfamiliar slid through his armor of arrogance. Genuine fear. He did what cornered bullies always do, swung wild. The heavy leather briefcase arced toward Mason's skull, clumsy and desperate. Mason didn't bother to slip it. He stepped forward, into the strike. Left hand caught the forearm. Right hand found the pressure point behind the jaw. Surgical. One twist of the wrist, one shift of weight. Sterling's own force turned against him. The briefcase clattered across the floor. The patriarch spun like a top, arm wrenched behind his back in a grinding chicken wing that drove him to his knees. Right beside the woman he just ordered thrown aside. The two Sterling sons lurched forward, then stopped. Mason glanced over his shoulder, and that glance was enough. His eyes held nothing, no anger, no heat. Just a flat, mechanical readiness that promised consequences they couldn't begin to calculate. 19 and 20 years old, private school polished, never once held accountable. They had never stood in the presence of a man who could take them apart without effort. They froze there, hands half raised, monuments to their own cowardice. The whole sequence, Mason's first step to both men flattened, lasted exactly 8 seconds. Silence flooded back into the terminal. Strange, suffocating. The only sounds were Arena's overturned wheelchair rocking against the floor and the distant chime of a boarding call from another gate. Mason held Sterling locked, his voice barely crossing the threshold of a whisper. Low, controlled, dangerous in its calm. Quote 25, Mason said. No anger, and that absence made it devastating. This was a man stating a fact as immovable as gravity. Quote 26. He tightened the arm lock, just a fraction, and Sterling's whimper came out thin, choked. His face darkened to a blotchy purple against the terminal grey. Arena still lay on the ground, propped on one elbow, hair tangled, face drained of colour. But her eyes were sharp, cataloguing everything. The way Atlas held the bodyguard motionless, ears flattened, focus absolute. She noted the working dog vest, the economy of Mason's violence, precise, proportional, professional. This wasn't some bystander playing hero. This was a trained operator functioning at a level of discipline she'd only encountered in classified files. Then the silence broke apart. Heavy boots, rhythmic and urgent. Metal jangling. Quote 27 Officer Vance, tall, rigid, all business in his dark blue airport uniform, led 3 officers into the priority zone. Hands rested on holsters, eyes swept the scene. A man forced to his knees, a bodyguard pinned beneath a dog, a woman crumpled on the floor. To fresh eyes, the picture told one story, and it was the wrong one. They hadn't seen the shove. They saw only the aftermath. A well-dressed family held down by a man who looked like he'd walked straight out of a war zone. Quote 28 Vance barked the order, taser drawn, and aimed square at Mason's chest. The other officers fanned out to cover the flanks, faces locked tight. Passengers nearby felt the shift. Authority had landed, and a low murmur rippled through the crowd. The Sterlings saw their moment and seized it, flipping the entire narrative in a heartbeat. "Thank God," Mrs. Sterling screamed, her voice pitched high enough to crack crystal. She lunged toward the officers, jabbing a shaking finger at Mason. "This man is insane. He attacked us. He sicked his dog on our security guard. Look at my husband. He's going to snap his arm. Arrest him. Arrest him right now." "Mister." Sterling read the opening perfectly, letting out exaggerated groans of pain. "He's out of his mind. I think he's a terrorist. Came out of nowhere. We were sitting here minding our own business, and he started screaming, throwing us around." He tilted his face up toward Officer Vance, eyes glazed with rehearsed agony. "Get that animal off my man before it kills him." Miller, still flattened beneath Atlas, didn't so much as twitch, but his voice carried just fine. Quote 33 a coordinated lie. A defensive wall of accusations stacked high and fast, designed to bury the truth before anyone could dig for it. The two sons piled on, voices crashing over each other in a panicked chorus. Quote 34 Officer Vance fixed his gaze on Mason, jaw rigid. Quote 35. Mason didn't flinch. His eyes tracked the taser aimed at his heart, then the officers, then down to Arena. He could read exactly how they saw him: tactical cap, thick build, aggressive dog. And he understood with cold clarity what came next. In the eyes of the law, right now, he was the threat. Slowly, with absolute deliberation, he released Mr. Sterling's arm, stepped back, raised both hands, palms open. Every movement as controlled as the strike that preceded it. __, quote, _36 __. The command was quiet, firm. The German shepherd disengaged instantly, jaws snapping one final warning before settling at Mason's left side. Still locked on the threat, but perfectly still, military discipline restored in a single breath. Miller clawed his way upright, sucking air. Mr. Sterling stayed down a beat longer, making sure the officers got a good look at the damage. "On your knees, hands behind your head," Vance ordered. A younger officer, also named Miller, no connection to the bodyguard, stepped forward with cuffs. "Officer, wait!" Arena managed, her voice fighting to cut through the Sterling's noise. But Mrs. Sterling had already pressed close to Vance, her expensive perfume thick against the tension. __, quote, _40 __. The cuffs snapped shut around Mason's wrists. Cold metal, familiar weight, unwelcome weight. He didn't protest, didn't attempt to explain. He understood something most people never learn. In a war of words between a man in a grey t-shirt and a family with a private attorney on speed dial, truth dies first. As they let him away, he turned back toward Arena. A flight attendant was helping her up. Her eyes held two things at once: gratitude and horror. Watching the man who'd protected her marched off like a criminal. The Sterlings had already clustered together, whispering, pointing, their faces resettling into that smooth, untouchable confidence that money buys. The battle inside the terminal was finished, but the war for Mason's freedom and Atlas's survival was only beginning. That metallic click of the handcuffs was a sound Mason knew intimately, though in his experience he'd always been the one applying them to high-value targets in lightless corners of the world. Now, the cold steel pressed into his own skin. A sharp reminder that on American soil, his particular skills weren't seen as protection. They were seen as a threat. As Officer Vance cinched the ratchets tight, the sound sliced through the hushed terminal like a single gunshot, ending the chaos and beginning the slow, bureaucratic suffocation of the truth. Mason stood rigid, eyes locked on some invisible point past the horizon. His face betrayed nothing, carved granite, even as the Sterlings launched their synchronized theater for the swelling crowd of Gawkers and uniforms. What followed through Terminal 4 was a clinic in public degradation. Not a protector being escorted, a dangerous offender. 3 armed officers flanked him at cautious distance, bodies tensed like men walking beside something volatile. The travelers surrounding them, the very same people who'd stood mute and paralyzed while Arena was shoved around, suddenly discovered their courage. They whispered. They pointed. Their faces wore that particular expression of easy moral certainty that only comes from standing safely behind a police line. Fragments of their talk reached him. Animal, thug, terrorist. The words hung in recycled airport air like poison. This was the first barb of his new reality, a question embedded in every witness's mind. How does a man who looks like a hero end up in handcuffs like a monster? But the real devastation waited at the terminal exit. A white animal control van sat idling there already, orange lights cycling with cold, mechanical patience. Two handlers in heavy, bite-proof canvas approached Atlas. The German shepherd felt it coming, the separation, and released a sound Mason had heard only once before. A midnight extraction, a desert wasteland. That same low, trembling keen, a frequency of pure, marrow-deep distress. Atlas didn't lunge, didn't bare his teeth. His training ran too deep for that, discipline fused into bone. He simply turned his amber eyes toward Mason, searching, waiting for the command that would restore order to this chaos. Quote 44. Irina called out, her voice fracturing as she fought to wheel herself toward the van. A flight attendant stepped in front of her. Safety regulations, quote, 45, Nobody listened. The handlers looped a catch pole around Atlas's neck, that heavy wire noose tightening against fur and muscle, and Mason's jaw clenched until pain radiated through his skull. They didn't see a decorated combat veteran. They saw 90 pounds of liability with teeth. They forced Atlas into a narrow, steel-reinforced kennel and slammed the door shut. That metallic bang, it was the sound of severance, a tactical amputation. Mason had felt less exposed in enemy territory than he did in that moment. While he sat in the windowless basement of the airport police station, bathed in dead fluorescent light, the Sterling family occupied a private lounge 1 floor above. Richard Sterling reclined on soft leather, ice pack on his shoulder, premium mineral water in hand. He wasn't speaking with police, he was speaking with Henderson, his lawyer. A man who'd materialized with impossible speed, briefcase loaded with case law and quiet menace. The narrative writes itself, Richard, Henderson murmured, his voice frictionless, emptied of anything resembling conscience. Random, unprovoked attack by a man with a documented history of military violence. Your boys are traumatized. Your security guard was nearly mauled. We're not simply pressing charges, we're building the official record. Beyond the lounge doors, Officer Vance was attempting to take Irina's statement. She sat in her damaged chair, shoulder pulsing with pain she refused to name, eyes lit with something sharp and deliberate. She gave her account with surgical precision. The shove, the verbal assault, how the Sterlings had cornered her, hemmed her in. She described Mason's response as controlled, proportional force applied to an active threat. Vance listened. His pen hovered above the notepad, but his gaze kept sliding sideways, toward the private lounge where the local chief of police was, at that very moment, clasping Richard Sterling's hand. The pressure was nowhere and everywhere at once. Sterling wasn't some ordinary passenger. He bankrolled political campaigns across the city. He could dismantle a police career with one conversation. "Look, miss," Vance said, dropping his voice low, "I hear what you're saying, but we've got 4 witnesses, 2 of them minors, plus a professional security officer, all stating the man in the grey shirt made first physical contact. They say he deployed his dog as a weapon. In the eyes of the law, that's assault with a deadly instrument. He saved my life. They shoved me out of my chair. If he hadn't intervened, that bodyguard would have gone further. The footage doesn't tell us much. Quote, 5, 3, There's a dead zone near the priority seating area. All we can make out clearly is the dog going after the guard, and your rescuer locking Mr. Sterling in a joint hold. Everything else comes down to your account versus theirs. And their account carries serious weight around here. By the time Mason was transferred to a holding cell at the county jail, the narrative had already been shaped. Local news aired a segment under the headline, "Violence in the Skies, Navy SEAL and Dangerous Dog Arrested After Airport Brawl." The piece featured a blurry photo of Mason in cuffs, alongside a crisp, high-definition interview with a weeping Mrs. Sterling. She described the horror of being stalked by a wild animal. No reference to the priority seating zone, no mention of arena. The truth had been surgically scrubbed, swapped out for a tidy fiction that shielded the powerful and condemned the protector. Inside his cell, Mason perched on the edge of the rigid plastic cot. Silence pressed down on him, thick and airless, giving room for old ghosts to murmur in the dark. He pictured Atlas in a cold concrete kennel, confused, alone. He thought about Arena, whether someone had helped her right her chair, retrieve her book, whether anyone had bothered at all. A knot of warring feelings tightened in his chest. Pride in doing what was right, and the acid understanding that in the world he'd bled for, doing what was right often cost the most. He knew the Sterlings would try to bury him. He knew their money would purchase witnesses and bend the prosecution. He understood the machinery was calibrated to grind him down, to preserve the comfort of the wealthy. But sitting there, staring at the reinforced steel door, Mason did not feel like a victim. He felt like a man behind enemy lines, patient, waiting for the right moment to move. The Sterlings believed they had won because they held the police and the press in their grip. What they hadn't grasped was the kind of enemy they'd just created, a man built for prevailing against impossible odds, and a woman who read the world in patterns of data no attorney could ever obscure. The questions had been planted, the stakes drawn tight, and the real hook was only now sinking in. The interview room at the county jail was a study in manufactured claustrophobia. Walls painted a shade of grey that seemed engineered to bleed the colour from a person's soul. A single fluorescent tube overhead, droning at a frequency that burrowed into Mason's skull. No window, just a heavy steel door with a sliding slit and a cold, bolted-down table flanked by two mismatched chairs. Mason occupied one of them, wrists uncuffed now, but his posture locked straight, a reflex of discipline no cage could erode. 3 hours he'd been here, ignored by guards, abandoned to the silence and the expanding mass of the unknown. He wasn't dwelling on the charges or attorney costs. He was seeing the way Atlas's tail had curled between his legs when they forced him into that van. He was seeing the look in the dog's eyes, pure betrayal. The steel door groaned on its hinges. A man entered who appeared to have been assembled in a facility specializing in predatory litigation. Elias Thorne, senior associate at the firm representing the Sterling family. Late 40s, salt and pepper hair slicked back so tight it resembled a helmet. He wore a charcoal suit cut with mathematical precision and a silk tie the shade of dried blood. Nothing about him belonged in a jail. He belonged on a yacht, in a boardroom, deciding the futures of thousands. He carried a slim leather portfolio and a sense of entitlement so dense It seemed to displace the oxygen in the room. He did not sit right away. First, he produced a spotless white handkerchief, wiped down the empty chair, then lowered himself with careful, rehearsed elegance. "Mr. Callahan," Thorne said, his voice polished and unhurried, the kind of voice that had never once needed to rise above a conversational tone. "My name is Elias Thorne. I represent the Sterling family. I'm here because my clients are, and this may surprise you, deeply compassionate people. They recognize your service to this country. They understand that a man who has witnessed what you've witnessed, sometimes that damage surfaces in regrettable ways. They have no desire to watch a Navy SEAL's entire life unravel over one reckless afternoon in an airport." He paused, waiting for something back. Mason offered him nothing. He sat motionless, eyes fixed on Thorne with a flat, predatory stillness, the kind that had frozen armed men in combat zones. Thorne cleared his throat. A brief flash of irritation crossed his features before the practiced smile returned, all teeth and no warmth. "Let me lay out where things stand. You're facing multiple felony assault charges. You deployed a trained animal as a weapon. You caused lasting, debilitating harm to a seasoned security professional. The district attorney is already building toward a 5-year minimum, particularly given who the victims are. But the Sterlings are prepared to make this disappear. Every charge dropped. Your service record untouched. You leave this facility tonight." Mason spoke for the first time. His voice came out low and stripped dry. "What's the price?" Thorne unclasped his portfolio and pushed a single page across the table. "Not a price, Mr. Callahan. A resolution. This is a prepared statement. You'll acknowledge that you experienced a momentary breakdown caused by post-traumatic stress. You'll confirm that the Sterlings behaved without aggression and that you misread the entire encounter. You'll issue a full public apology for your actions and for your dog's unprovoked attack. And you'll consent to a voluntary medical discharge from the Navy. In return, the Sterlings withdraw everything. A clean page. You go somewhere quiet, build a simple life, and none of us ever speaks of this again." Mason didn't glance at the document. __quote_61_. Thorne leaned closer, his expensive cologne cutting against the sharp bleach smell of the room. Quote 62. He produced a second document, a red stamp at the top, read, Quote 63. Quote 64. Thorne let those words dangle in the silence like a blade on a thread. __quote_65. __. The air in the room turned cold. Mason's hands, flat on the table, curled slowly into fists, knuckles draining white. The threat was precision-targeted at the only thing Mason still had left to lose. They weren't merely demanding a false confession, they were forcing him to choose. Let them erase his partner's truth, or let them end his partner's life. The silence held for a full minute. No sound but the metronomic tick of the wall clock and the heavy pulse drumming in Mason's chest. He thought about Atlas, the way that dog had stayed close through 3 deployments. The way Atlas could sense a nightmare building before Mason's own mind registered it. Quote 66, Mason said. His voice dropped so low it was almost inaudible, yet every syllable landed like a sentence being handed down. Quote 67. The smile slid off Thorne's face. What replaced it was something raw, cold, undisguised contempt. He rose, snapping the portfolio closed, the sound sharp as a verdict. "Very well. Have it your way, Mr. Callahan. You want to be a martyr? Fine. But understand this. By the time I'm finished, the public won't see a hero. They'll see a volatile, unstable veteran who unleashed a beast on a family. And the dog? I will personally ensure the injection happens tomorrow morning. You had a chance to save him. You chose your pride instead." Thorne signaled the guard. The door opened. He walked out without a backward glance, expensive shoes striking the linoleum with deliberate arrogance. Mason sat alone in the grey room. The fluorescent light hummed louder than before. His gaze fell on the empty chair. For one unguarded moment, pure agony crashed through him like a wall of black water. He'd refused the deal, but the price was a waking nightmare he wasn't certain he could endure. He shut his eyes. Atlas's face filled the darkness. And there, in that concrete cell, Mason made a promise to himself. He would not simply fight for his freedom. He would dismantle the Sterling's architecture of lies, brick by brick, wall by wall, until nothing remained but naked truth. He just prayed Arena was doing the same. The courtroom smelled of old mahogany and institutional disinfectant. Cold light buzzed overhead, sterile and unforgiving. A place built not for justice, but for judgment. Jennifer Hartley, 20 years of prosecutorial experience carved into a face like a sharpening stone, stood before the jury with the kind of authority that makes defense lawyers lose sleep. She did not see Mason as a man who had served his country. She saw a piece of evidence to be broken apart. __quote _69 __, she began. Her voice was low, rhythmic, an instrument tuned for condemnation. __quote _70 __. No room for nuance, no space for doubt. She painted a portrait of a man trained as a weapon, who had forgotten he was no longer at war. His tactical expertise became not a service, but a threat, a dangerous skill turned against a family that had simply been trying to enjoy their afternoon. Richard Sterling sat in the second row, tailored suit, medical sling that looked more expensive than any legitimate bandage. He radiated the quiet, untouchable confidence of a man who had already purchased today's outcome before the first word left anyone's mouth. Beside him, Mrs. Sterling pressed a silk handkerchief to her eyes at careful intervals, a performance staged for the local reporters who'd been tipped off about the violent veteran. 12 ordinary citizens watched with widening eyes as Hartley described the savage animal that had mauled a professional security guard. She kept their attention precisely where she wanted it, on the injuries, on the fear. Questions about Mason's stability hung in the air like smoke. She avoided overwhelming detail, instead drawing the jury deeper into the supposed trauma of the Sterling family. By the time Richard Sterling took the stand, the transformation was complete. His voice dropped to a tremor. He spoke of wanting to protect his sons, of the shock when violence erupted without warning. __quote _71 __, he lied. His eyes locked on the jury foreman, manufactured sincerity polished to a shine. Quote, 72. He limped faintly on his way back to his seat. No medical evidence supported it, but for courtroom theater, it was flawless. Miller followed. His testimony recast Atlas as a bloodthirsty animal trained to kill. He omitted one detail with surgical precision. The dog hadn't even broken his skin. The room held two competing versions of the same man. Hero. Threat. The tension between them was nearly physical, a pressure you could feel against your chest. Mason's public defender, Marcus Chun, rose to cross-examine. He looked like a man trying to hold back a flood with his bare hands. Marcus was 31. His caseload was physically impossible to manage, and whatever idealism he'd carried into this profession was eroding fast under the weight of the Sterling family's reach. Every attempt Mason's defender made to reference the priority seating sign, or the fact that Arena had been shoved, Hartley rose with an objection. Judge Hendricks sustained nearly every one. Judge Hendricks had presided over trials for 18 years. She understood the weight the Sterling name carried in this county. The defense looked scattered, outmatched, pointless. Mason sat at the defense table, hands clasped, face locked in iron discipline, while lies stacked around him like bricks in a wall meant to bury him. The afternoon's climax arrived when Hartley addressed the judge for her closing request of the session. Quote, 73, quote, she paused. Her gaze drifted to the empty space beside Mason, the space where Atlas should have been. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 74, underscore, underscore. That word, destruction, landed like a hammer blow. For the first time, Mason's composure cracked. Not a shout, not a movement, just a tightening of the jaw so fierce it was visible from the gallery. He wasn't fighting for his own freedom anymore. He was fighting for the life of the only partner who had never left him. Arena sat in the gallery's back row, her damaged wheelchair tucked into the aisle, her face unreadable as she watched the prosecutor's victory lap. The Sterling's lawyers had silenced her through legal maneuvering. A procedural error Henderson manufactured kept her from testifying. But as Hartley sat down, smug and certain of her win, Arena's hand drifted to the small, encrypted tablet on her lap. She wasn't just a woman in a chair. She was a woman with access to data the Sterling's money couldn't touch. She watched the judge prepare to adjourn. A cold, sharp smile crossed her lips. The Sterlings believed they were the only ones who understood power. They were about to learn that a Navy SEAL and a Pentagon analyst were the wrong people to back into a corner. The question hung in the stale courtroom air. What would happen when the truth finally broke through the wall of money? The atmosphere in that room shifted the instant Marcus Chun called his final witness. Until this moment, the prosecution had successfully shaped the narrative into something simple. A violent veteran, a dangerous animal, a story tailored to jury bias and a powerful family's interests. But as Arena maneuvered her wheelchair toward the front of the room, a different energy trailed behind her. Cold, calculated, a stillness that planted doubt in every mind present. She didn't resemble the victim the Sterlings had tried to erase. She looked like the architect of a coming storm. Richard Sterling shifted in his seat. His confidence flickered for the first time as he watched the woman he had physically discarded prepare to speak. Jennifer Hartley was on her feet before Arena reached the stand. Your Honor, I must object. Ms. Ramirez was already excluded from the witness list due to procedural delays. Her testimony is irrelevant at this stage. Marcus Chun didn't retreat. He stood with a posture that had finally found its spine. His gaze met the judge's, sharp, piercing, unwavering. Your Honor, the witness's identity and the evidence she carries were previously classified under national security protocols. Those restrictions were lifted exactly 10 minutes ago. This isn't merely a witness. This is a revelation that strikes at the very heart of the truth. Judge Hendricks leaned forward, eyes narrowing as she studied Irina. State your name and occupation for the record. Irina adjusted the microphone. Her voice carried through the wood-paneled room with the clarity of a struck bell. My name is Dr. Irina Vance. I am a senior intelligence analyst with the Department of Defense, currently stationed at the Pentagon's Office of Net Assessment. A collective gasp swept the gallery, a revelation that seized every throat in the room. The disabled woman they'd spent days hearing about was a high-level government official. Henderson, the Sterling's lawyer, looked like he'd taken a blow to the chest, his face drained to ash. A local assault case had just become a matter of federal interest. __quote, _79 __. Marcus began, his voice steady. Quote 80, quote 81, Irina said. Her eyes locked onto Richard Sterling with an intensity that made him flinch. Quote 82. She drew a small silver drive from the pocket of her cardigan. __quote, _83, __. The courtroom fell silent as Marcus loaded the file. On the large monitors mounted along the walls, a new angle of the terminal materialized. Not the grainy, distant footage they'd seen before, crystal clear. The jury watched without a sound, as Richard Sterling's voice filled the room, cold, mocking, telling his sons that the masses didn't matter. They saw the shove. They saw Miller seize the wheelchair and hurl Irina to the floor. The crack of her body against tile was louder, more visceral than anyone had prepared for. It landed in the gut of every juror watching. Then they saw Mason, a blur of calculated motion, not rage, precision, proportional defense executed like doctrine. They saw Atlas pin the bodyguard with a discipline that left no room for argument. The prosecution's portrait of Mason as an unhinged killer dissolved frame by frame. There he was, shielding Irina with his own body while the Sterlings screamed lies at arriving officers. Irina continued, her voice cold and professional. Before Hartley could draw breath for an objection, the heavy oak doors at the rear of the courtroom slammed open, hard enough to rattle the light fixtures. Down the center aisle walked a man who looked carved from granite. Dress white uniform of a Navy commander, silver oak leaves gleaming at his shoulders. Commander Silas Grant, commanding officer, SEAL Team 3. Behind him, 6 men in full dress uniforms, ribbons and medals, forming a wall of military honors that shrank the room around them. They moved with a synchronized precision that commanded silence before respect. They didn't stop until they stood directly behind Mason, a line of unwavering solidarity. Commander Grant didn't wait to be called. He stepped to the bar, his voice deep, carrying the full weight of command. __, quote, _86, __. The atmosphere had shifted. This was no longer a trial. It was a reckoning. The Sterlings were no longer the powerful family in control. They were small, petty bullies, facing the combined weight of the United States military and the testimony of a Pentagon analyst. The jury was no longer looking at Mason with suspicion. They watched him the way people watch a man who's been stabbed in the back by the very ones he bled for. From the stand, Irina looked down at Mason. A quiet smile, small, deliberate, crossed her lips. The hook was buried deep now. Truth was dragging everyone toward a verdict no fortune on earth could purchase. The defense had transformed scattered evidence into a story of honor. All that remained was the fall of the gavel. The silence after Dr. Irina Vance's testimony wasn't the empty kind. It was dense, pressurized. A silence before detonation. On the high-definition monitors, the truth hung frozen in razor-sharp clarity. Irina on the ground, the Sterling family watching with the warmth of marble statues, and Mason Callahan, one man standing as a wall between cruelty and its target. Judge Patricia Hendricks peered down from her bench. Her expression had shifted, no longer neutral. It carried the cold, honed edge of a judge who had seen enough. Her gaze cut toward the prosecution table, where Jennifer Hartley huddled with her assistants in frantic whispers. That ironclad confidence from earlier? Gone, replaced by shuffled papers and desperate eyes. Henderson, lead counsel for the Sterlings, sat frozen. A wax figure, bloodless, every shade of color drained from his face. He understood a simple courtroom truth. You can argue interpretation. You cannot argue against 4K government surveillance footage. "Commander Grant," Judge Hendricks said. Her voice carried a new resonance. New authority. "Please take the stand." The room held its breath as Commander Silas Grant rose and moved toward the witness box. His skin looked like leather left out in decades of weather. His eyes carried the mass of 1,000 operations. He walked with a precision that made the air itself stiffen. He didn't glance at the attorneys, didn't acknowledge the gallery. He looked at Mason. One sharp nod passed between them, brief, loaded with meaning only they could decode. Grant was the kind of commander who never needed a microphone. His voice rolled out low, a rumble you felt through the mahogany floorboards more than heard. "Chief Petty Officer Mason Callahan is not simply an operator under my command," Grant began. Each word landed heavy, deliberate. "He is the standard we use to define the word protector. 13 years in the shadows of this world, ensuring that people like the Sterling family sleep soundly in their expensive beds, never knowing the names of the men keeping them safe. His training is not a weapon of aggression. It is a tool of surgical restraint. What you witnessed on that footage was not an assault. It was the highest expression of military discipline applied to a domestic crisis." Grant leaned forward, both hands flat on the railing. The Department of the Navy conducted its own internal review of the incident at Terminal 4. Chief Callahan followed every protocol of engagement. He identified a vulnerable non-combatant under assault by a superior force. He neutralized that force using the minimum physical intervention required. Treating him as a criminal is an insult to the uniform he wears. A pause. Then the commander's voice dropped even lower. ___, quote, _92, ___. Grant's testimony struck like a defibrillator to the heart of the case. Every question the prosecution had planted about Mason's character resolved, dissolved. Jennifer Hartley stood. For the first time in her career, her voice trembled. __, quote, _93, ___. Judge Hendricks didn't let her finish. "Sit down, Ms. Hartley." The words sliced through the courtroom like a blade drawn clean. "I have seen enough. The evidence provided by Dr. Vance is irrefutable. The testimony of Commander Grant is definitive. This court was presented with a narrative of violence that has proven to be fiction, manufactured to protect the vanity of those who believe themselves above the law. She turned to the jury. They were nodding together. Their faces held a raw mixture of shame and indignation. In the matter of the state versus Mason Callahan, Judge Hendricks announced, gavel raised high, all charges are dismissed with prejudice. Chief Callahan, you are free to go. She held the silence one beat longer. Furthermore, this court issues an immediate emergency stay on the euthanasia order for K9 Atlas. He is to be returned to the custody of the Navy SEALs immediately. The gavel came down hard, a crack that split the room like thunder. The sterling empire of lies collapsed in a single stroke. No one cheered. 47 Marines and the SEAL team rose as one body, silent, spines straight, chins lifted, a tribute deeper than any applause could carry. But justice had not finished its work. Judge Hendricks shifted her gaze to the second row. Mr. Richard Sterling, Mr. Miller, and the young men involved, you will remain in this courtroom. Based on the video evidence submitted by Dr. Vance, I am referring this matter to the district attorney. Immediate investigation into felony assault, perjury, and obstruction of justice. Officers, take them into custody for processing. The ground beneath the Sterlings gave way in an instant. Two bailiffs, the same ones who days earlier had led Mason in handcuffs, now crossed the floor toward the Sterling family. Richard Sterling's mouth opened, closed, opened again. Nothing came out. A man drowning in air. His sons stood frozen, designer clothes hanging off them like costumes from a game they never should have played. Miller, the bodyguard, dropped his head without resistance. Metal clicked around his wrists. They were escorted through the side door, the very same door Mason had been dragged through days before. The courtroom held its silence like a breath finally released. 10 minutes passed. Then, that side door opened again, and a familiar sound filled the air. Rhythmic panting, claws on tile. Atlas, freed from his concrete cage at the animal shelter, burst into the room. No bark, just a sable blur streaking across the floor. He didn't stop until his front paws hit Mason's chest, his head pressing deep into the man's neck. Mason, the same man who had faced mortar fire and shrapnel without flinching, dropped to his knees. He wrapped his arms around the dog and held on, eyes closed. Feeling that steady, familiar heartbeat against his own. Irina watched from her chair, tears slipping down her face as warrior and dog became whole again. When Mason and Irina finally made their way toward the courthouse exit, they found the steps covered in dress uniforms. The sun hung low, throwing long golden light across the stone pillars. Commander Grant and the SEAL team had formed a corridor of honor. Mason pushed Irina's wheelchair through the center. Every man in uniform raised a slow, deliberate hand to his brow. That salute was not only for a chief petty officer, it was for the woman who had used her mind to rescue one of their own. Mason stopped at the bottom of the steps, looked up. The cold weight he'd carried for weeks, finally lifting. He glanced down at Irina, who reached up and wrapped her fingers around his hand. "Where to now, Chief?" she asked, a quiet smile on her face. Mason looked at Atlas, sitting tall beside him. Then back at the woman who had changed everything. "Home," he said, voice steady, clear. "We're going home." They moved forward together, the courthouse darkness falling away behind them, a future opening ahead where honor wasn't a burden anymore. It was a shield. The story of Mason, Arena, and Atlas carries a truth worth remembering. Real strength has nothing to do with the size of a bank account or the volume of a voice. It lives in the willingness to stand for those who cannot stand alone. In a world where money and influence try to rewrite what actually happened, honor, integrity, and the unbreakable bond between a soldier and his loyal dog will always burn brighter than the darkest lie. Privilege may try to crush the innocent, but the courage of righteous people will eventually shatter every wall corruption can build. If this story reached something deep inside you, if it reminded you what sacrifice and justice truly mean, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment below with your thoughts, and subscribe for more stories of faith and courage. May God bless you and those you love with peace, steady strength, and the bravery to do what is right. Type Amen in the comments if you believe truth will always prevail. Thank you for being here. Sometimes, the quietest kind of bravery reshapes an entire life. Hold steady. Keep your heart open. We'll meet again soon.